When a Mexican cartel attacks a remote farm, no one expects the dogs to lead the defense. Hunting and police dogs become warriors, defending their trainer's home. The attackers face an unexpected counterstrike, seamless coordination between humans and animals. The cartel unleashes heavy and chemical weapons, but the dogs refuse to back down. Each assault is repelled with intelligence, speed, and startling discipline. This isn't just a story of survival, it's a story of the unbreakable bond between man and dog. Stay with us to find out how the story ends, and don't forget to subscribe. More gripping stories are coming just for you. The old farmland stretched over rolling hills and dense clusters of oak trees, a deceptively serene landscape that cradled a modest homestead and a sprawling kennel. Its owner had spent decades perfecting the art of training both hunting and police dogs, molding each pup from a bundle of raw instinct into a confident and disciplined partner. Few in the county fully understood the intensity and passion behind this man's work. His name was Thomas McCallan, and though he rarely ventured beyond the nearest town, whispers of his extraordinary canine training had traveled much farther than he would have ever guessed. Unbeknownst to him, dangerous forces had started weaving their way toward his beloved property, drawn by the value of what he offered: uniquely trained dogs capable of relentless loyalty and razor-sharp tactics. In the quiet hours of early morning, an uneasy tension simmered in the air. The dogs sensed it first, breaking the silence with low growls that caused Thomas's farmhands to glance warily toward the tree line. What had once been an ordinary morning check of the kennels now became a prelude to something far more dangerous. The farm had never been targeted before, its fences and gates were meant to keep in the animals, not keep out intruders. Yet the dogs' restlessness spoke of a hidden threat. It wasn't a curious coyote or a wandering fox. There was a collective awareness among the animals that something far more malevolent was watching from beyond the property's borders. Thomas, though not a man of many words, had a keen sense of the bond that existed between him and every dog under his care. Their subtle signals told him enough to trigger caution. He moved through the kennel rows, checking each cage, verifying that every lock was secure and each occupant was calm. His older dogs, retired from active duty, paced in their runs like they remembered some distant confrontation. Younger ones, still in training, huddled close in edgy anticipation, as if responding to an invisible command that the normal routine had shifted. Over the last decade, many of Thomas's dogs had found their way to police units across the state, bolstering K-9 divisions that needed sharp noses and unwavering courage. Others had become prized hunting companions, tracking game in the dense woodlands for those who valued a reliable partner. Stories of these canines had spread, capturing the interest of not only legitimate agencies but also those who operated in the darker corridors of the criminal world. A prominent cartel, expanding its operations across borders, had marked the kennel as a potential goldmine of canine assets, dogs that could be repurposed if only their training could be forced in a new direction. Hidden watchers studied the patterns of the farm from vantage points in the surrounding hills. They documented how Thomas's staff fed and exercised the dogs, noting the layout of the barns and the routes the farmhands followed. They noticed the camera systems, but they also noticed certain blind spots. The watcher sensed that this place was not heavily fortified, assuming the old farmer had not prepared for an assault. Their superiors believed this kennel could be co-opted, that these dogs could be stolen or coerced into working for them. What they failed to grasp was the intangible element that made each canine here more than just an obedient work animal. The bond between trainer and dog was not so easily hijacked, and the instincts honed at the McCallan kennel would not submit to an unfamiliar hand. Preparations to breach the property began under the cloak of darkness. The cartel's operatives traveled in unmarked vehicles, splitting up before they drew too close to the farm, continuing on foot to avoid detection. Thomas's land, while not equipped with military-grade defenses, was vast and complicated. The field stretched into an undulating horizon, laced with old irrigation ditches, natural ravines, and woodlines thick enough to conceal an entire squad. With practiced efficiency, the intruders spread out in small teams. They cut through the perimeter fence with carefully muffled tools. Unaware that the dogs could smell their anxiety, the attackers believed they were invisible in the night. A few of the farmhands, lying awake in the small bunkhouse, felt a strange unease. Moments later, the dogs began to bark with greater intensity. Roused by the commotion, the hands threw on jackets and boots, then searched for the cause of the disturbance. By the time they reached the main barn, they saw the first signs that something was amiss: an open gate that should have been latched, a length of fence that looked tampered with. The real alarm, however, came from the dogs themselves. Some were pawing at the kennel gates, desperate to be free, as though they already understood the danger creeping closer. When the first muzzle flash sparked from the shadows, it was not accompanied by the usual thunderous echo. The cartel's firearms were fitted with suppressors, and one of the farmhands was hit before he even realized what was happening. The dogs erupted into fierce howls, a collective cry that carried across the fields. The old farmhouse lights came on, slicing the darkness and revealing the silhouettes of men in tactical gear moving swiftly among the trees. Thomas, stepping onto his porch, could see shapes darting behind the tool sheds and the feed silos. He quickly grabbed a radio from the kitchen counter, knowing full well that he had no illusions of being a soldier. But his dogs, trained for loyalty and skill, might just be his best defense in this dire moment. Chaos spread across the property as muzzle flashes flared in staccato bursts. Some of the farmhands tried to protect the outer buildings, brandishing shotguns loaded more for wild hogs than human assailants. The cartel's approach was organized, coordinated by hand signals and night vision optics. They had expected minimal resistance, intending to secure the area quickly and capture the most promising dogs. Yet, instead of helpless confusion, they found bursts of defiance. They discovered that the kennel had more than a few watchful guardians willing to fight back. A large group of dogs, incensed by the commotion, barked and snarled at the chain link. Thomas directed those who were able-bodied to release select canines, but only those old enough and trained enough to handle the confrontation. The emerging hounds joined the conflict, weaving through the farm's uneven terrain with the agility of creatures that had been raised running across that very ground. They circled around buildings and corners, using their acute senses to locate the intruders' positions. Soon, the attackers found themselves facing a threat they had not anticipated: canines operating on their home turf, guided by handlers who had spent years perfecting silent commands and subtle signals. The advantage of stealth they relied on began to slip away. Small teams of dogs, accompanied by a handful of resolute farmhands, launched countermaneuvers. Now the property became a swirling tapestry of hunts and chases, with flashlights piercing the darkness, the glow of muzzle fire intermittently illuminating the dust swirling in the air. Despite their disciplined approach, the cartel operatives realized they were tangled in a battlefield not laid out on any typical blueprint. Their pre-raid planning had focused on typical farm structures, ignoring the hidden gullies and the winding footpaths behind rows of horse corrals. They had assumed that all they needed to do was subdue a group of unsuspecting workers, but they had not accounted for the dog's sophisticated training. Each bark, each snapped twig, each shapeless movement in the shadows rattled them. Their attempt to gather near the main barn to regroup failed when a sudden flurry of large canines flanked them, driving them away from the kennel's heart. At the same time, a portion of the cartel force concentrated on reaching the breeding pens, convinced that the older dogs were locked there. They had intelligence that this was the area storing both the most experienced police dogs and the younger ones in training, prime targets for intimidation and forced reconditioning. Guided only by minimal light, they navigated an old orchard that concealed them from direct sight. The orchard, however, was a place where Thomas often let his best hunters roam freely to refine their tracking instincts. These dogs recognized every tree and hedge. In the hush of night, the orchard came alive with low growls and shifting shapes as the canines zeroed in on the intruders. Tension spiked when an explosion of movement occurred near an irrigation canal that cut behind the orchard. The attackers had attempted to bypass the orchard entirely, hoping to scale the canal's embankment to reach the main pen from the side. Several of Thomas's top-tier dogs launched a ferocious assault from the edges of the canal, coordinated by a single farmhand. The attackers, startled by the speed and precision of the assault, fired off frantic bursts into the night. The muzzle flashes briefly illuminated large silhouettes of snarling dogs leaping into their midst. Lacking the advantage of a stable vantage point, the intruders scrambled down the slippery slope, only to be driven back by unstoppable jaws and feral growls that echoed off the canal walls. Desperate to regain control, the cartel's field commander ordered a retreat from the orchard and canal area. His men regrouped closer to the kennel's perimeter, behind storage trailers that once housed farming equipment. Some attempted to call for heavy support from those waiting by the distant tree line, signaling for more sophisticated weaponry to flush out the defenders. Yet the radio signals crackled with static, hindered by the unexpected layout of the terrain and the thick tree cover. The infiltration had turned into a precarious stalemate, with each side jockeying for position under the faint glow of yard lights. In the midst of the chaos, Thomas remained near the main barn, coordinating with the remaining farmhands. Though many had no background in firefights, they trusted his understanding of how each dog functioned. They formed pairs, one handler and one dog, strategically positioned around the property's most vulnerable access points. The synergy between human and canine had been honed over countless hours of training. Even in this tense scenario, the dogs responded to subtle commands and signals, proving that the real strength of the kennel was far more than just muscle and teeth. As the assault wore on, the cartel soldiers grew frustrated by their inability to secure any significant foothold. It became evident that they had underestimated the defenders' resolve and the dog's strategic value. What was meant to be a sudden raid to seize prized animals and force the kennel's compliance was now an ongoing skirmish. The attackers realized that if they could not capture these dogs, they might opt to destroy the kennel entirely, denying anyone the advantage these canines provided. They began to position small squads armed with heavier rifles around the outskirts, preparing to unleash a more devastating barrage on the barn and the central kennels. A new wave of fear coursed through the defenders as they saw muzzle flashes flicker from positions once thought too distant to be a threat. Bullets ripped through flimsy wooden panels and soared over corrugated metal roofs. Some dogs yelped in alarm, their instincts telling them to take cover. Farmhands huddled behind tractors and hay bales, returning fire where possible. Thomas, crouched by an old feed bin, did his best to keep track of the dogs' movements. But the scale of the confrontation threatened to overwhelm them all. The kennel buildings themselves were not merely static structures. They had been set up with long corridors to accommodate varied training exercises, as well as reinforced doors to isolate reactive dogs. Now, these features doubled as defensive positions. Handlers guided the dogs through back entrances, maneuvering out of the line of fire. In the swirling dust, the cartoonish flicker of overhead lights illuminated the determined faces of those ready to protect their home and livelihood. Fire spread to a small hay storage area when a stray bullet ignited the dry stack, forcing the defenders to shift their focus. The bright orange glow rose behind the main kennel, sending thick smoke into the night sky. For a moment, it seemed as if the flames would trap the dogs inside. With unstoppable dedication, Thomas signaled a group of farmhands to contain the blaze. They used the tractor's water drum and a few extinguishers from the workshop. Meanwhile, half a dozen dogs remained on high alert around them, barking at the slightest sign of movement in the swirling smoke. The cartel's frustration escalated. Their specialized operatives, unaccustomed to being stymied by a mere farm, communicated desperately with each other, urging an escalation of force. They had not come prepared for a prolonged engagement, lacking the heavy firepower for open warfare. Their approach had relied on stealth and intimidation. Now, pinned down and scattered, they faced a formidable defensive effort fueled by the unwavering bond between man and dog. Had they anticipated such fierce resistance, they might have brought more men, heavier equipment, or even rethought the entire mission. But no one had truly predicted that a rural kennel and a quiet farmer could spark this kind of fight. Amid the confusion, several smaller teams of attackers tried to regroup near an old grain silo. They intended to consolidate ammunition and mount a coordinated push toward the main barn. Unbeknownst to them, the dogs had picked up their trail. With nimble strides and unwavering focus, the canines prowled behind tractor equipment and through tall grass, guided by a single farmhand who knew every contour of the terrain. The roar of gunfire from elsewhere on the property masked the low growls of the circling dogs. When the farmhand believed the moment was right, he gave the signal, and the animals charged with startling power. Taken by surprise, the intruders scattered in all directions, leaving behind crates of ammunition and supplies that could have been used to turn the tide. Now the kennel defenders sensed a possible advantage, but they remained wary of the chaos. The fact that some attackers had retreated did not mean the fight was over. The defenders suspected that more might be waiting just beyond the fence line, ready to surge in if the initial team failed. A sense of urgency filled the air. The standoff might soon intensify if reinforcements arrived with heavier weaponry. The farmhands, although not professionally trained soldiers, displayed a grim determination that came from protecting not only their livelihoods but also the animals they considered family. The dogs mirrored this resolve. Even the younger ones, who had never faced real conflict, followed the cues of the older, more experienced canines. Each bark or snarl served as a rallying point for defenders who found it impossible to abandon animals who had entrusted them with their loyalty. The night was alive with tension, and even the towering oak trees seemed to hold their breath, as if acknowledging that the future of the kennel teetered on a knife's edge. Hoping to exploit the defenders' sense of duty toward the dogs, a group of cartel fighters attempted to circle around the back of the main kennel building. They planned to break into the structure, free or seize as many dogs as possible, and use them as leverage. Their thinking was that the defenders would hesitate to fire if it endangered the animals. As they carefully cut a secondary fence, they could hear the frantic barking from inside. Slipping into the shadows, they advanced along the kennel's outer wall, scanning for cameras or guards. However, these intruders failed to notice a pair of older bloodhounds quietly emerging from an adjacent storage shed. With practiced stealth, the dogs alerted a nearby handler, who swiftly repositioned to confront the threat. A chaotic scuffle broke out, and once again the cartel's efforts to infiltrate were thwarted by canine vigilance. All around the property, similar clashes erupted and subsided. The interplay between cunning attackers and resolute defenders seemed never-ending. Yet with each passing moment, the defenders gleaned more knowledge of where the invaders were concentrated, and the dogs refined their sense of where the greatest threats lay. The ragtag unity of the farmhands, guided by Thomas's understated leadership, began to knit together a coherent defense. The invaders lost their early momentum, trapped in a patchwork of contested zones around the barns, silos, and orchard rows. Deep inside the main barn, the lighting was reduced to a single flickering bulb powered by a backup generator. Thomas guided some of the farmhands to reorganize the structure's interior, creating narrow choke points. He knew they could not hold off a large-scale assault forever, but at least they could make any intrusion as costly as possible. He also directed a few of the staff to secure the farm's old radio tower near the workshop. If communication with the outside world became viable, they might manage to signal for help. However, the risk remained high that the cartel could jam or intercept those signals. Each step required balancing immediate safety and the long-term survival of the farm. Away from the barn, a battered truck belonging to the cartel was left idling near the orchard, its headlights partially illuminating the orchard floor. Inside, a lone operator tried to coordinate via radio, calling on codes that signaled the rest of the cartel's network. The farmland's position, nestled among hills and scattered outbuildings, distorted the signals enough to hamper clear communication. The operator grew increasingly desperate, urging any available squads to converge on the orchard. But pockets of defenders and dogs made any movement hazardous. The orchard that had once yielded fresh fruit was now a labyrinth of bark and darkness, concealing men and animals locked in a lethal hide-and-seek. Moments of stillness would emerge, only to be shattered by abrupt bursts of gunfire. Occasionally, a shrill yelp echoed where a dog was grazed by a bullet or an attacker fell under a canine's jaws. Every corner of the property had become a pressure point in this conflict, each one threatening to collapse under the strain. And yet, beyond the muzzle flashes and frantic radio chatter, one reality remained: the kennel and its defenders were still standing, held together by the unspoken bond that united dog and human in a mutual pledge to keep each other safe. The flames from the hay storage smoldered on, casting an eerie orange glow across the yard, while the wind shifted and carried the smell of smoke and spent gunpowder through the old oak grove. Although the night felt endless, dawn would eventually come. The knowledge that daylight might bring either salvation or an even more brutal escalation weighed on everyone present. Exhausted farmhands tried to find moments to reload and catch their breath. Dogs panted from the exertion but refused to back down, as if aware that to relent now could mean the downfall of everything Thomas had built. No one could say how many more waves of attackers might appear. If the cartel decided to commit more resources, the defenders might be overwhelmed. Yet the cartel, too, had limits. Their immediate objective was to obtain valuable assets with minimal fuss, not to engage in an all-out war. The extent of the defenders' resistance introduced a stark cost-benefit question. The attackers' superiors, waiting for updates on the periphery, would soon demand results or order a fallback. The night's confrontation had escalated into a scenario neither side had fully anticipated. Even amidst the turmoil, glimpses of the farm's daily life persisted, the distant neigh of a horse from a nearby corral, the rustling of livestock stirred by the gunfire, the battered pickup truck next to the main farmhouse. These details reminded everyone involved that this was not a typical battlefield. It was someone's home, a place of honest work where dogs had been bred and trained for legitimate purposes, be it law enforcement or ethical hunting pursuits. To see it torn apart by violence felt like a desecration of something wholesome and essential. Thomas, moving between the barn and the kennels, silently reminded himself of the hours spent training each dog. He recalled the careful steps, the hand signals, the practice drills designed to shape them into reliable allies for the forces of law or the quiet hunts in the deep woods. Now, those very skill sets had become the last line of defense between survival and ruin. The kennel's formidable reputation, once just local legend, had materialized into a bulwark of unstoppable canines and devoted handlers. The cartel's foot soldiers realized they were facing dogs with not only raw power but also a cunning that had been cultivated through purposeful conditioning. This synergy was far beyond the typical guard dog scenario they might have expected. All across the property, from the orchard to the grain silo and from the canal to the main barn, the situation pressed toward a breaking point. The stray flickers of gunfire gradually shifted from sporadic to near constant, a sign that both sides were running out of patience. The defenders, though still spirited, were clearly outnumbered and limited in ammunition. The attackers, losing men and morale, struggled to unite their scattered squads. Snarling dogs continued to harass any attempt at organized movement, turning each rush into a fracturing of positions. Yet in the darkness, a new plan formed among the cartel's more experienced operators. Realizing that surprise was no longer on their side, they decided to use intimidation and raw force to crush the kennel's defenders. They would gather their strongest fighters and focus on a single point of entry, unleashing all the firepower they had to break the defenders' line. If successful, they could then sweep through the property, capturing or eliminating all who resisted. If it failed, they might be forced to retreat entirely. From their perspective, a decisive gamble was now the only path to salvage the mission. And so, with cold determination, they prepared for one last push, oblivious to how the land itself and the dogs that inhabited it would meet them head-on when the moment arrived. The attackers gathered behind a row of rusting machinery that lay abandoned along the southern boundary of the property. They crouched there, reloading magazines and passing around what little medical supplies they had to stanch bleeding wounds. Their earlier attempts to infiltrate the kennel had turned into skirmishes scattered across fields and outbuildings, costing them time, ammunition, and morale. Yet there was still an undercurrent of determination pulsing through their group. Grim-faced with adrenaline coursing through their veins, they assessed the night's obstacles, tightly coordinated defenders, cleverly positioned dogs that struck from hidden angles, and an unyielding layout of barns and corrals that seemed to shift in the darkness. All these factors forced them to craft a new plan on the spot. They decided that their best chance now was a direct assault on the main barn and kennel complex. If they could break the defenders' line at its strongest point, the rest of the farm would fall into chaos. Some men voiced concern over the dogs that patrolled the perimeter, pointing out that each attempt to move openly in the yard had been met with well-trained canine aggression. Others worried they were losing precious time. But their makeshift field commander insisted that raw firepower and shock tactics would shatter the opposition. The men prepared flash grenades, setting them in an improvised belt so that a few could lob them in quick succession. Someone pulled out a short-range launcher intended to demolish the barn doors if they needed to force entry. The hope was that the defenders, once threatened at the very heart of their property, might finally break. In the meantime, Thomas and his closest farmhands strategized inside the barn with anxious focus. They understood that the attackers were regrouping for something more coordinated, a final push that could overwhelm their improvised defenses. Several men had taken minor wounds, and a couple of the older dogs were clearly favoring injuries. The rest of the pack, however, remained resolute, scanning every shadow for movement. Sporadic gunshots continued to echo in the distance as smaller outposts of the cartel tested the periphery, probing for weaknesses. The defenders paid close attention, using short radio bursts whenever they spotted more activity. This decentralized communication allowed them to shift resources quickly, though they remained painfully aware that they could only stretch themselves so far. The orchard area had grown quiet, the canal banks no longer rattled with confrontation, and the fires that had threatened to spread along the haystacks were mostly contained. But a hush had fallen over the property, a taut anticipation that lingered in the smoke-laden air. The intangible sense of an oncoming wave set everyone on edge, both man and dog. Thick plumes of haze still drifted across the yard, forming a ghostly backdrop against which any sudden movement became a silhouette. With no further illusions about the nature of the threat, the defenders waited for the next eruption of violence. Eventually, the cartel's direct assault commenced with an abrupt barrage of gunfire aimed at the barn's wooden exterior. High-caliber rounds punched through the outer walls, forcing anyone inside to find cover behind storage crates or old metal equipment. Dogs barked furiously at the onslaught, adding to the clamor as bullets whizzed past in shrill arcs. Thomas, huddled with a few of his best-trained hounds, signaled for his farmhands to hold their positions until the attackers drew closer. If they returned fire too soon, the cartel would simply pin them down while others flanked the building. Instead, they had to wait for the intruders to commit to a breach. After the initial volley of bullets and a series of flash grenades thrown near windows, the attackers surged forward under the partial cover of the swirling smoke. Several men raced toward the barn's main entrance, launching another flash grenade to disorient anyone inside. The device popped in a piercing flash, and that was the signal for the dogs. With a coordinated effort, two of the older hounds bounded through the temporary haze, lunging at the intruders trying to pry open the wide barn doors. The men staggered backward, struggling to keep their footing under the dogs' unrelenting attack. Suppressed weapons spat in short bursts, but the frantic aim betrayed their alarm. A second group of attackers attempted to move along the side of the barn, planning to infiltrate through a smaller side entrance. Here they encountered a farmhand who had wedged himself behind a stack of feed barrels, accompanied by a wiry Belgian Malinois that had already proven its keen sense of threat detection. As soon as the intruders stepped within range, the dog shot out from the shadows, clamping onto the closest man. Gunfire ricocheted wildly off the metal barrels, creating a deafening racket. The attackers managed to wound the dog, but not before one of their own went down, incapacitated by savage bites. The remainder pulled back, momentarily halted in confusion and fear. Despite these initial setbacks, the cartel pressed on, capitalizing on every point of entry they could find. They had numbers on their side, and they intended to use them. The defenders had to scramble to cover multiple angles. The main kennel building, where young dogs were housed, became a prime target, and a small band of heavily armed intruders forced their way in by smashing a padlocked gate. Inside, rows of crates and partitions formed a labyrinth of chain-link enclosures. Some of the younger dogs cowered at the sudden intrusion, but others, more attuned to conflict, barked and snarled, causing the intruders to hesitate. It was enough time for a farmhand with a wooden baton and a single-shot rifle to intervene, though he had little chance of standing against automatic weapons. He relied on surprise and the dog's fury, managing to knock one attacker off balance and slam the gate behind him, effectively trapping two intruders in a confined corridor with 3 agitated canines. The men inside realized with horror that they had unwittingly sealed themselves in with the very animals they sought to control. Meanwhile, Along the farm's western boundary, a separate faction of the cartel attempted to make use of heavier firepower that had been brought as a last resort. Their plan was to unleash a barrage of explosive force to compromise the barn's foundation and any other solid structures. If they could bring down critical buildings, they believed the defenders would have no choice but to retreat, leaving the valuable dogs behind. The slow clank of metal announced the setup of their small mortar-like device, likely scavenged from illicit arms trades. Once in position, they aimed it haphazardly at the main barn, hoping to terrorize the defenders into surrender. Thomas, hearing the ominous thump of the makeshift mortar, ordered an immediate evacuation of anyone not directly engaged in combat, instructing them to regroup in the orchard with a selection of dogs. Although the orchard had already seen its share of fighting, it offered more cover than the open yard. Crates, hedges, and the natural slope of the terrain provided places to wait out incoming fire. This decision underscored a crucial point: while Thomas and his staff did not want to abandon their stronghold, they could not afford to remain in a building that might collapse under shelling. The first explosive round whistled before slamming into the ground near the barn, sending up a geyser of dirt and debris. Windows shattered from the blast, and a section of the wooden exterior was torn away. Though it missed a direct hit, it was enough to rattle the entire structure. Dust and splinters showered down, blanketing the defenders who coughed and shielded their faces. Dogs whined in confusion but maintained their readiness. Thomas shouted for a withdrawal, urging the able-bodied to move quickly. Some of the wounded were helped along, and the older dogs guided the younger ones through the chaotic environment as though sensing the urgency themselves. In the orchard, the defenders found momentary respite. A few lanterns hung from low branches, casting flickering light onto the makeshift assembly area. Farmhands tended to each other's wounds, using torn cloth and any available antiseptic. The dogs paced or lay panting, their eyes scanning the darkness, alerted by the staccato of gunfire that still resounded near the kennel. A perimeter was formed, a loose ring of humans and canines, each prepared to repel attackers should they attempt to push into the orchard. Radios crackled with fragmented chatter, some reporting on the mortar's second shot that had hit the barn's rooftop, igniting a fire that now glowed ominously against the night sky. Sensing their success in driving some defenders away from the barn, the cartel men at the mortar station coordinated a shift in targeting. They intended to pound key points of the property, each blast meant to terrify anyone still resisting, breaking down morale. But as they loaded another shell, a flurry of movement erupted from the darkness. Several swift dogs, guided by a single handler who had circled around through a shallow ravine, descended upon them with disciplined aggression. Barking and snarling, the dogs drew the attackers' attention just as the handler lobbed a small homemade flash charge. It detonated with a dazzling burst, causing the would-be mortar crew to stagger in disarray. Before they could recalibrate, the dogs lunged, seizing arms and legs. A volley of desperate gunshots followed, some skidding into the dirt, some piercing the night air uselessly. Within moments, the mortar station was neutralized, leaving the device standing silent. One or two cartel fighters managed to scramble away, but their plan to continue bombarding the barn had been decisively interrupted. Back at the orchard, Thomas and the rest took faint encouragement in the partial success. Yet, they knew the battle was far from over. The kennel complex was compromised, and though the mortar threat appeared subdued, the cartel still had enough men scattered around the farm to maintain pressure. Sporadic bursts of gunfire flared from various directions. At times, the calls over the radios revealed new pockets of resistance and danger, from stray groups of intruders combing the horse stables to hidden snipers trying to pick off defenders from an elevated vantage. Every corner of the land felt haunted by the possibility of violence. Through it all, the dogs remained an integral part of the defensive strategy. Their ability to move swiftly, sense intruders through smell and sound, and respond to subtle cues from their handlers gave the defenders an almost uncanny awareness of where the attackers massed or retreated. Some of the older dogs limped from injuries, yet refused to leave their handlers, bearing themselves with fierce loyalty. The younger ones, though shaken, became emboldened by the presence of their elders. In these moments of pitched danger, the depth of training proved invaluable. No amount of forced or rushed instruction could replicate the seamless communication that these dogs displayed with the farmhands. They sensed changes in posture, heard the faintest shift of a rifle's safety latch, and often warned of an oncoming threat before it materialized. From the attacker's perspective, the farm had turned into a labyrinth of lethal surprises. Their plan to seize or destroy the kennel had progressed at a terrible cost. Disorganized attempts to gather the prized animals had failed repeatedly, each one ending in a frantic retreat or an assault from dogs that appeared from nowhere. Any illusions they had about capturing these canines and retraining them for cartel operations were gone. At this point, they would be lucky to leave the farm at all. Some even considered cutting their losses and fleeing, but the presence of their more ruthless leaders kept them in line, under threat of worse consequences if they abandoned the mission. Slowly, the night wore on, marred by smaller flare-ups of gunfire and the acrid odor of burning wood. Every so often, a cluster of attackers would regroup for a push, only to be driven back by defenders who fought in tight coordination with the dogs. The orchard itself became a fortress of sorts, ringed by watchful eyes and sharpened ears. Some of the farm's employees, once just caretakers of stables or kennel attendants, were now forced into the role of protectors, relying on the dogs as an extension of their will to defend this land. Despite their exhaustion, none voiced any intention of surrendering. The cost had been too high, the incursion too brazen. With each passing minute, the bond between them and the canines deepened into something resolute and unbreakable. A flash of headlights soon appeared on a gravel road at the northern edge of the property. The cartel had brought in a support truck, possibly containing more fighters or additional supplies, in an attempt to shift the balance. The sound of its engine filtered through the orchard, and defenders tensed, expecting another wave. Thomas recognized the route, an old logging road that skirted the farmland before cutting through a pine stand. If the newcomers established themselves there, they might create a staging point for launching a decisive flank. He summoned two of his most experienced handlers, instructing them to intercept, though he gave no specifics on how they should proceed. They knew the territory intimately, that knowledge would have to suffice. Together with a small pack of dogs, the two handlers dashed off under the cover of darkness. They navigated winding trails and shallow gullies that offered natural concealment. The farmland's topography had been an ally all night long, and it continued to serve them now. By the time they neared the logging road, the truck had already parked, lights off, blending into the darkness except for a faint glow from the dashboard. Figures emerged from it, rifles slung over shoulders, scanning the perimeter for threats. Using hand signals, the handlers directed the dogs to fan out, one staying near a thick cluster of brambles, another creeping alongside a dilapidated fence line. The approaching men had no inkling that they were within mere yards of well-trained canines, each carefully positioned for an ambush. The first dog initiated contact with a deep, resonant bark that echoed through the pines. The men froze, reflexively aiming their weapons at vague shapes in the undergrowth. The second dog burst from the fence line, forcing the group to pivot and open fire. In that moment of confusion, the other dogs charged from hidden angles, snapping and lunging, sowing panic among the attackers. The handlers used short, loud whistles to coordinate the canines, ensuring they attacked and withdrew in fluid motions. In less than a minute, the new arrivals found themselves in full retreat, piling back into the vehicle. A frantic attempt to start the engine resulted in a near collision with a tree. The battered truck sped away, its rear tires kicking up gravel and dirt. Any reinforcements or supplies it might have delivered vanished into the night, thwarted by the same relentless synergy that had repelled every other intrusion. With the threat at the logging road repelled, the defenders claimed a small but significant victory. Still, they were under no illusion that the danger was over. The farm had not been fully secured, and pockets of attackers remained scattered around the grounds. None were bold enough to mount another large-scale assault, but sporadic firefights and infiltration attempts persisted, fueled by desperate ambition on the attackers' part and unwavering resolve on the defenders. The orchard served as both refuge and rallying point, though its cover was far from impenetrable. Any advantage the defenders held was tenuous, hinging on their ability to maintain lines of communication and keep the dogs engaged where they were most effective. Exhaustion plagued them all. Men who normally spent their nights resting before the dawn chores were now wide-eyed behind hastily erected barricades, weapons clutched in trembling hands. Dogs, even those in peak condition, panted heavily and limped on sore paws. No one could predict how many more hours this standoff would last or if a final push might descend upon them at any moment. The property that once epitomized peaceful labor and the warm bond between humans and animals had been transformed into a patchwork of smoldering debris and scarred earth. Looming overhead, faint stars flickered through the haze, indifferent to the mortal drama unfolding below. In a lull between firefights, Thomas gathered a handful of farmhands and handlers to reassess their dwindling ammunition and supplies. Their conversation was urgent but calm, underscored by the knowledge that they couldn't withstand an indefinite siege. Radios crackled with partial updates. A wounded farmhand had taken shelter in a small chicken coop with 2 dogs. Another group of defenders reported that they had sealed an interior fence to block an intruder's path. The scale of the property made it difficult to coordinate a single, sweeping counteroffensive, and a scattered approach to defense suited them better, given the dogs' knack for territorial agility. Still, every plan hinged on the attackers eventually weakening, running out of the resolve to continue. Just when it seemed that the night might finally settle into a standstill, fresh muzzle flashes glinted near the stable block, followed by the frantic neighs of frightened horses. The attackers had either regrouped or been reinforced, and they were now attempting to claim control of another vital section of the farm. Thomas grimaced at the thought of leaving any area unprotected. The stables contained not just horses but also spare supplies, including a small set of tranquilizers and veterinary gear that could be crucial for treating wounded dogs. Reluctantly, he dispatched another handful of defenders to prevent the infiltration, accompanied by a determined brace of canines that had spent little time in direct confrontation so far. Their energy would be an asset, though their inexperience in a live firefight made it risky. The stable block, sitting on a gentle rise near a grove of willow trees, offered a strategic vantage for anyone seeking to observe movements across the wider pasture. That alone made it a prize the cartel operatives would not ignore. By the time the new wave of defenders arrived, the attackers had already forced the stable doors open, scattering terrified horses in all directions. The inside was dimly illuminated by lantern light, flickering against the distressed movements of the animals. Gunfire shattered the wooden partitions, sending splinters flying into the stale air. The defenders split into pairs, each pair guided by a canine, fanning out around the perimeter to encircle the stable building. A hush fell, followed by a sudden outburst of barks as the dogs detected the intruders. Shots rang out in retaliation, muzzle blasts briefly revealing the attackers taking cover behind feed bins and support beams. One of the defenders, pinned by gunfire, pointed to a side corridor that might allow them to flank the intruders, but reaching it meant passing an open gap with no cover. Taking a chance, he coaxed his dog to cross first, hoping it could draw attention away from his movement. The dog darted ahead, weaving past debris. The attacker who tried to track its movement hesitated just long enough for the defender to sprint to a cluster of bales stacked near the corridor. Once there, the dog circled back, together creating a pincer angle. Forced into a corner, the intruder fired wildly, the echo amplified in the stable's tight confines. The combination of gunfire and frantic horses produced a harrowing clamor that rippled through the night. Similar micro-engagements played out in every corner of the stable. The defenders exploited the building's stalls and feed rooms to maneuver. The dogs used their heightened senses to detect the intruders' footsteps, guiding the farmhands through labyrinthine corridors. The staccato of bark, gunfire, and stomping hooves rang into the early hours, resonating with the frenetic pace of a confrontation that neither side could afford to lose. An attacker attempting to set fire to a stack of hay was tackled by a German shepherd, his lighter tumbling across the straw as he struggled against the dog's unyielding grip. In another stall, a cornered intruder slammed a door shut to keep out an attacking hound, only to find a second dog lunging at him from an adjacent tack room. Bit by bit, the defenders gained the upper hand, pushing the attackers to the far side of the stable block. Sensing the tide turning, the intruders attempted a hasty withdrawal, though they had no direct route back to the tree line without exposing themselves to open ground. Taking advantage of the confusion, the defenders pressed harder, herding the attackers into the open yard near the stable's exit. There, under a sky still tinged with lingering smoke, the canines closed in, supported by the volley of rifle fire from a few farmhands covering the approach from the orchard. The would-be stable raiders found themselves fully outmaneuvered, forced to dash away across the pasture, some disappearing into the gloom while others collapsed under concentrated fire. After securing the stable block, the defenders tried to calm the terrified horses as best they could, ensuring none were trapped or severely injured. Supplies were quickly inventoried, revealing that none of the tranquilizers or veterinary medications had been taken or destroyed. Though their resources were stretched thin, it was heartening to see that vital equipment remained intact, especially given the uncertain battles yet to come. Exhaustion weighed on every movement. Dogs slumped with tongues lolling from exertion, while the humans labored to stay vigilant, fueled only by adrenaline and makeshift rations. The farm seemed determined to protect its own, and maybe that collective spirit gave everyone a final wellspring of resolve. As the conflict ground on, one question loomed: how much more would the cartel invest in this failing operation? The scale of the violence was already far greater than any participant could have imagined, and even the bravest or most ruthless among the attackers knew the mission had spiraled out of control. Their equipment was scattered, their men exhausted and dwindling in number, and they had yet to secure a single prized dog to exploit. Worse still, every movement was met by an uncanny coordination between the defenders and their canines, who seemed to navigate the chaos with an almost supernatural ease. If the attackers pressed further, they risked annihilation. But retreat carried its own punishments from superiors who expected results. Indications of fracturing discipline within the attackers' ranks grew. An intercepted radio transmission carried the sounds of arguments, possibly men accusing each other of failing to hold ground or to take advantage of certain opportunities. Others insisted on calling in more reinforcements, while some demanded a withdrawal. Eavesdropping on these signals, the defenders realized that they faced an enemy whose cohesion was unraveling, giving them a faint glimmer of hope. If they held on, if they kept applying pressure, perhaps the cartel might decide this operation wasn't worth the mounting costs. Yet the defenders knew they couldn't simply wait. They needed to preempt any final, desperate gambit from the attackers, something like a last show of force that could break the farm's defenses for good. Thomas weighed the potential of moving a small strike team to mop up the pockets of resistance scattered around the property. The risk was high, venturing out into the gloom might expose them to ambush. Still, every minute they delayed gave the cartel time to regroup or attempt sabotage. With careful consideration, he selected a handful of farmhands and their dogs known for exceptional tracking and stealth. They would weave through the orchard and beyond, seeking out any clusters of intruders attempting to hide or reorganize. The team set off, threading between twisted trunks and scattered brush. Their dogs, well acquainted with the farmland's nuances, guided them silently to each area where movement or voices were suspected. Sometimes, the intruders ran at the first sign of the dogs. Other times, cornered fighters opened fire, resulting in short but intense firefights. Each success in driving the attackers away or forcing them to surrender chipped away at the cartel's presence, slowly tightening the defenders' hold on the property. By the time the group circled back toward the orchard, they had neutralized or scattered several small pockets of resistance. Though battered, they returned triumphant, certain that they had pruned the remaining threat to a fraction of what it had been. In the center of the orchard, exhausted men and dogs greeted them, exchanging subdued gestures that held the weight of relief. No one broke into open celebration. Instead, they quietly savored the sense of unity that had formed under crisis. The orchard, once a place of rustic calm, now bore the scars of bullet impacts on tree trunks and the footprints of frantic combat. Yet it also contained an undeniable spirit of perseverance. Even the dogs, with their tongues out and ears alert, seemed to stand guard as though ensuring nothing would breach this circle of solidarity. Distant sporadic gunshots still rang out from time to time, indicative of scattered conflicts or frantic attempts by the remaining cartel operatives to regroup. But the defenders sensed that the core of the raid had been broken. Some men collapsed in exhaustion, entrusting their dogs to keep watch. Others sat wide-eyed against apple and pear trees, rifles cradled in their arms. Thomas made rounds with an almost paternal concern, checking injuries, offering words of encouragement, and ensuring the dogs were tended to. Though not a trained medic, he had grown adept at basic field care for animals, and by extension had picked up some knowledge for treating human wounds as well. Under the orchard's canopy, lit by the flickering light of a few battered lanterns, an unspoken bond of gratitude pulsed among them. And still, the farmland lay covered in the detritus of conflict. Smoke curled from charred areas, bullet-riddled structures loomed with broken windows, and the faint smell of gunpowder mingled with the sweet tang of crushed grass. No one could yet declare victory. The night felt like it might stretch on forever, anchored by the tension that had built up since the first shots were fired. But for the first time since the attack began, the defenders entertained a cautious sense that they might prevail. Their numbers were thinning, ammunition was running low, and fatigue had become a common enemy, but the indomitable connection between man and dog remained. It was an unbreakable thread that the cartel, for all its tactical plans and brute force, could not sever. Such was the scene that greeted the first glimmer of dawn, that faint paling of the sky hinting at a sun still hidden behind distant hills. Whether the daybreak would bring a respite or provoke one last surge of violence was impossible to predict. The orchard stood as a bastion of regrouping will, while the smoldering barn, the battered stables, and the scattered outbuildings bore silent witness to a night of strife. Whatever came next would be faced as everything had been so far, side by side with the dogs, fighting for a land and a legacy that refused to submit. The dogs, though clearly weary, remained alert, their instincts still engaged despite the toll of the night. Many bore scratches, bruises, and the kind of strain only a prolonged confrontation can cause, yet their eyes still burned with the same protective focus that had kept the farm from falling. Thomas stood at the edge of the orchard, binoculars in hand, watching the hills beyond the southern fence. His breath was steady, his presence calm, but his eyes were calculating every potential movement. He had known loss before, he had buried good dogs, even better people, but never on this scale. His land had become a battlefield not by choice, but by necessity, and now, with the sky slowly brightening, he had to consider the next move not just for defense, but for survival. Somewhere beyond the ridge, the cartel's commander, known only by the name Calderon, was finalizing a decision. His operation had collapsed into disarray overnight. Reinforcements had either been cut off or turned back. His elite units had failed to secure any critical objective, and their morale was fraying like loose wire. Still, Calderon wasn't the kind to leave quietly. In his warped logic, retreat equaled disgrace. He would not abandon this assault without one last spectacle of destruction, something that could justify his failure to his superiors and scar the land enough to ensure it was never seen as a victory by those who had defended it. That final play came in the form of a concealed transport approaching from the east, an armored vehicle outfitted with a chemical dispersal system, repurposed from agricultural equipment. It carried a payload designed to flush out entrenched defenders with smoke and disorientation gas. While not explicitly lethal, it was more than enough to sow chaos, blind the dogs, and render the defenders vulnerable. Calderon intended to unleash it directly into the orchard, hoping to break the last cohesive stronghold the farm possessed. Thomas didn't see the vehicle itself, but he caught the odd shimmer of dust rising in a trail from a distant access road, one he knew had been blocked off months ago. Someone had cleared it. He radioed to his remaining lieutenants, alerting them of a potential incoming threat from the east, and immediately ordered handlers to move the most injured dogs and wounded humans deeper into the old storm shelter buried beneath the equipment shed. By now, the defenders had learned to read each other without speaking. Movements became gestures, instructions became glances. Dogs followed silently, reading their handlers' urgency. No one panicked, even as the ominous droning sound of the approaching machine grew louder. The orchard, already worn down by gunfire, scorched earth, and debris, was about to be tested again. When the chemical truck crested the final hill, its silhouette emerged like some mechanical beast. The dispersal unit glinted in the sun, and twin barrels hissed as the machine prepared to spew its payload. But Thomas had prepared for contingencies. He knew the land better than anyone alive, and as soon as the vehicle reached the top of the slope, it triggered a dormant trap, a length of reinforced wire, strung tight between two anchor points buried in the earth. The front wheels of the vehicle struck the line and jerked violently sideways. The machine didn't flip, but it slowed, giving the defenders precious seconds. That pause was all the dogs needed. From the ravine just beneath the hill, 3 of the fastest dogs, 2 Dutch shepherds and a massive bloodhound named Duke, charged uphill with handlers close behind. The smoke hadn't deployed yet, giving them clear air and a clean shot. The cartel gunner, manning a side-mounted weapon, opened fire, but the angle was poor. One of the shepherds darted right, feinting with speed and drawing the fire. Duke barreled forward, leaping onto the side panel of the transport and dragging the operator off the side with sheer mass. The remaining cartel soldiers attempted to regroup, but by then the defenders had emerged from the orchard in coordinated waves. Dogs ran low to the ground, dodging and weaving between broken fences, forcing the attackers into retreat paths that led straight into choke zones mapped by Thomas during training drills. The machine's dispersal unit sputtered, then caught fire after a wild round struck its tank. Thick white smoke billowed upward, blinding everyone, attackers and defenders alike. Inside the haze, the dogs relied on smell and memory. This was their territory. They moved like shadows, attacking and retreating in sequence, preventing the enemy from forming defensive lines. One dog, a young Labrador named Rook, had never been in combat until this night. But now, covered in grime and ash, he worked alongside his handler to flank the last remaining operators of the chemical truck. They cornered them by a rock wall that had once supported irrigation pipes. The cartel men fired in desperation, missing every shot. Rook lunged, his momentum unbreakable, and the fight ended in the dust and silence. Back at the orchard, the smoke hung like a ghost over the trees. Several of the defenders were coughing violently, but the protective measures taken earlier, wet cloths over mouths, hastily distributed masks, had prevented serious injury. The dogs recovered quickly. Their training had included drills in smoke-filled environments, and their handlers knew how to help them regulate their breathing. Thomas walked through the orchard, checking on every person, every dog. His boots left dark prints in the dew-damp grass. No one said much, there was nothing to say that hadn't already been felt. Relief was tempered by the knowledge that it could all spark again in seconds. Still, they had survived the worst. The smoke was thinning. The sun had crested the hills. From the northeast field, a lookout called in an alert. A convoy, black SUVs with tinted windows, was approaching. But there were no gunshots. No advance infantry. The vehicles pulled up slowly to the ruined southern gate, where bodies and debris still littered the entrance. And then they stopped. A man in tactical gear stepped out of the lead vehicle. His jacket bore no insignia, but his stance was unmistakable. Federal. His team fanned out, weapons lowered. One of the defenders, still posted near the orchard's edge, signaled the all clear and relayed the message: the feds had arrived. Word spread slowly. The battle was over. What followed wasn't victory in the traditional sense. It was exhaustion. Grief. Relief. The federal agents moved methodically across the property, documenting everything, securing every corner, retrieving what evidence they could from scorched barns and bullet-riddled walls. They questioned the survivors, treated the wounded, catalogued the injuries sustained by dogs and humans alike. Calderon was gone. Whether dead, captured, or fled into the hills, no one could say. But he had failed. The cartel's plan to turn the Kennel into a war trophy had shattered against something they couldn't predict: not firepower, not security systems, but loyalty, between man and dog, and between people willing to defend a life's work with everything they had. In the days that followed, the farm became a point of national interest. News crews hovered, trying to film what little was left of the barns. Government officials arrived, nodding solemnly, making vague promises. But Thomas remained quiet through it all. He rebuilt what needed rebuilding. He treated the dogs first. Then the people. He refused interviews. He refused medals. What mattered most to him were the animals that had stood beside him in the night when everything else burned. And the dogs? They stayed. Every one that could still walk remained at Thomas's side, patrolling the perimeter not out of habit, but as if they remembered. Even the youngest among them carried themselves with a strange, quiet maturity, transformed, perhaps, by the trial they had endured. The land healed. Slowly. So did the people. Scars, some visible, some buried deep, remained, but so too did a sense of triumph. They hadn't just saved a farm. They'd saved the bond between them and the creatures they trained, trusted, and loved. And somewhere, over the ridgeline where the enemy once gathered, wild grass had begun to grow again. The weeks following the battle brought a heavy stillness across the land, as if the earth itself had exhaled after holding its breath through the storm. The trees of the orchard, though scarred and split, began to bud again. Grasses regrew through blackened soil. But even as nature recovered, the people and animals who had defended the farm carried a different kind of weight, one that didn't heal as easily. Thomas found himself rising before dawn each day, just as he always had. But his routine had changed. Before feeding the animals, before checking on the irrigation pumps or walking the perimeter, he would stop by the north field, now marked with a hand-carved wooden sign bearing the simple word, Guardians. It wasn't a grave, not officially. But it was where they had buried the collars of the dogs they'd lost. Only 6. 6 out of over 30 trained canines. It was a miracle by any measure. But for Thomas, it was 6 too many. The surviving dogs had changed. They were quieter now, more watchful. They no longer barked at wind-blown trash or passing deer. They had learned the scent of war, the rhythm of gunfire, the way humans breathe differently when fear takes hold. Their bond with their handlers had deepened into something unspoken, pure instinct, born not just of training but of having survived something primal, together. Government officials had returned again, this time with offers. Grants. Proposals. Military interest in replicating Thomas's methods on a national scale. He listened, nodded when appropriate, but said little. He didn't trust systems that only found value in dogs once they'd been proven in blood. What he valued was the loyalty earned in quiet repetition, training at sunrise, shared meals, the way a dog lay its head on your foot at the end of a long day. Yet he wasn't blind to what was coming. Word had spread far beyond the county lines. Other criminal groups had taken notice of what happened here. Some might be deterred. Others might see it as a challenge. So Thomas began again. Not rebuilding, but refining. A new section of the orchard was cleared, not for planting, but for training. Elevated walkways. Tunnels sent challenges hidden in the brush. Simulated stress environments with firecrackers, tear gas, low-frequency sound. He started working with a new generation of dogs, pups born weeks before the attack. Their eyes still held the wild curiosity of innocence. And yet, every one of them had a parent who had stood firm in the chaos, had chosen not to run. One of the youngest, a sable-furred Malinois with a white mark on his chest, showed early signs of brilliance. He learned faster than most. Reacted sharper. But what struck Thomas most was the way the pup never barked. Even when startled, he simply tilted his head, evaluated, and moved. The handler started calling him Echo. Thomas had a different name in mind, Air. The farm had changed forever. But it wasn't broken. It had adapted. And so had those who lived there. Far beyond the hills, men whispered about the dog farm that killed a cartel. But those who'd been there, who had seen what really happened, knew the truth. The dogs hadn't killed a cartel. They'd protected their family. And they were ready to do it again.